Hello everyone and welcome to Module 2. Because this module is so long, it compromises something like 8 chapters of your pop-up book. I wanted to create a video that did two things. First of all, define some terms. Second of all, forecast some of the types of assessment that we're going to be talking about in the next 8 weeks. So, instead of starting this as a lecture where I tell you a whole bunch of stuff, I'd prefer to do this part by reading you a case study and asking you what kinds of assessments you recognize. In this way, you can sort of self-assess what you know already and make some notes to yourself about what you don't know yet. That will, I think, help prepare you for some of the information that will be coming later. So, this case study is from a book called Authentic Assessment in Action by Linda Darlin Hammond and others. The best thing you can do is get a pencil and pen and see if you can see how many of the assessments you can get. Midway through the school year, 9-year-old Hakeem joined Susan Gordon's 3rd grade class. Miss Gordon soon learned that Hakeem had trouble with even the simplest reading, writing, and math tasks. When asked to engage in such activities, he would often respond with angry, disruptive behaviors, in some instances overturning chairs or throwing objects across the room. When given time to pursue his own interests, however, he spent much of it drawing and building things. Encouraged, Miss Gordon gave Hakeem drawing paper, wooden blocks, Legos, and other construction materials, and frequently talked with him about what he was doing. In the weeks that followed, Hakeem's classroom behavior improved dramatically, and before the school year was out, he had completed several complex projects, including a set of airplanes and other flying vehicles, along with an illustrated book depicting the history of flight. Although Hakeem's projects enabled him to practice and strengthen his emerging literacy skills, his scores on district-wide multiple-choice achievement tests remained low, not only from that year, but in the 4th and 5th grades as well. Fortunately, Hakeem and Mrs. Gordon compiled a portfolio that revealed his ongoing process in reading and writing, his exceptional talents in drawing and sculpture, and his persistence and attention to activities in which he was passionate. 7 years later, in the 8th grade, Hakeem was still doing well in school. So, what did you notice? What assessments are at work? Well, if you noticed that there was some informal assessment going on, you're right. Remember that informal assessment is anything you observe as a teacher. Notice that Miss Gordon is assessing his behavior, noticing that when he acts out and when he doesn't, noticing when he's engaged and when he's not. Notice that there is also a formal assessment in place, which is in fact the portfolio itself, where she keeps track of Hakeem's progress and learning. Notice that there's also some formative assessment. This is probably the least understood of kinds of assessment, in which things are not graded necessarily, but you watch a longer process at work. And that there's a summative assessment, which is also the portfolio, which is sort of a compilation of learning. There's also the standardized achievement test that rears its ugly head at the end, which it turns out measures where he is with that particular measurement device, but notice it doesn't tell the whole picture of what he knows. So what we want to have when we talk about assessment is what Grant Wiggins calls a preponderance of evidence, because it's really hard to tell how well somebody understands something, especially emerging literacy skills, by just administering, say, a multiple choice test. What I think will be important here is to talk about the word assessment itself. When we talk about assessment, what we usually mean is the art of making inferences about what somebody knows. And notice, Assessment would be so easy if we could just open up students' heads and look inside and say, well, there's the information. But it's so much more difficult. In order to see what our students know or can do, we have to watch them very closely because we can't see what's in there. And so we have to give them tasks, and good ones, that are designed to show how far along a certain path they have gone. I think better than our usual definition of assessment, which is to make inferences about student learning, is to go back to the Latin roots of the word, which means to sit beside. And in a figurative way, that's what assessment at its best is. That insofar as you can, you watch what the student is doing, you watch closely, and then you make those inferences based on a certain set of criteria that should be clear to you and to the student. The next thing I want to mention, and this is something that your book doesn't point out, but it's really important, and you may remember this from your ed psychology class, is that assessment determines how and why you learn something. Imagine this for a minute. If you're in my health class and we are learning all about the different kinds of food, and we're learning about the food pyramid and how it has evolved over time perhaps, if I give you a multiple choice test, you can show me what you've memorized factually about those elements on the food pyramid. Now, how useful that is up for grabs. But if I give you a performance task, meaning that I make you use that information some way. For instance, maybe I make you develop what you think would be the most nutritious school lunch. And maybe we ask the cafeteria workers to actually make the best school lunch that is deemed to be the best school lunch out of all the 7th grade submissions. Notice what happens there, that not only do students learn the factual thing about the kinds of ways that food is categorized, but the nutritional part becomes more important because we're applying it to something that is social and real. And in that way, we have something that's called an authentic assessment, meaning that's something we do in the real world. It's not just something we're doing in school to fill in the blanks. It's authentic. It's something people do. So a really big takeaway, I think, that I would like to foreground this class with is that really good assessments promote learning. They don't just measure it. They actually are learning experiences in and of themselves. And that's why I think it's so exciting to work with you this term to develop things that are engaging, that they are process-oriented, and that they foster complex thinking and not just the acquisition of facts. So in conclusion, I'm just going to show you a couple more slides. Assessments can be selected response, meaning fill in the blanks. That's okay if we just want to get some basic factual knowledge about what a kid knows. They can be performance assessment, which is a big project or a complex task such as designing a lunch and determining its nutritional value. It can be a portfolio, which is a collection of work. It can be affective assessment, which is you're measuring attitudes, which is something I never did as a middle school teacher, but I'm going to try it on you. Finally, and here's a last slide, there are certain ways that assessments can actually promote learning. And the first is by influencing motivation. If you have performance tasks that are fun, that are social, you are more likely to have students participate because part of that feels authentic and fun to them. Good assessments can also influence students' cognitive processes as they study. They can provide feedback about the learning processes, and they can encourage students to feel strongly about the assignments intrinsically, and not just because their parents or maybe you want them to do well. So, With those thoughts in mind, I hope you enjoy your first chapter of Popham this week as you think about why we should care about assessment. I look forward to your thinking.